Now I want to do a tutorial on how to use your ruler, because we just learned how to do half square triangles, to use your scraps, and how your scraps can be also a really neat way of creating some variation and beautiful colors and make those really intricate pieces or blocks that are beautiful. If you see this block right behind me, all of these little blocks that we used in this quilt were from scrap fabric that this lady donated to me to do for the church. And so I hope you like this tutorial. It's really about making your scraps into usable fabrics and also how to organize your scraps. Have a great day. Okay, so what do you do with all your scraps? I really hate being really disorganized, and I hate messes. And even though sewing can be something messy, I like to reorganize it and make sure that my space is clean right after every time I sew. So I ended up having a lot of these scraps. I have a tendency to throw these things away because I didn't see any real value to them. But my friend made a quilt, and she did a beautiful scrappy quilt. And I asked her, how in the world did you get all the variation of colors? And she told me by saving her scraps. So she would kind of get on my case about keeping them or giving them to her anyhow. So I found a way of organizing myself in a disorganized kind of mess that can happen with having a lot of scraps all over the place. So I have a container, and this container has all my scraps. I also have a different container. Let me find it. And this container has my sewn scraps, meaning every time I sew something on my machine, I tend to put a scrap all the way through the machine so the machine doesn't jam up at the bottom of the feed dogs. So it has some stability as it's feeding through, especially when I'm feeding thicker fabrics together. And so here's a sewn seam. And so I'm just going to do a small demonstration as I'm doing this do next. And these are scraps that they had left over. And these are leftover squares that they didn't use in their cross block. And so I got all these containers, and I went ahead and I labeled them, like I labeled this one, 2.5 inch half square triangles. So all those leftover pieces from different projects I have in this container. And these are all 2.5 inch. They don't go into this container unless everything is completely ironed and measured, so that I know that everything in this container is 2.5 inches. Also, I made another area of containers. This came like a little block case, a case of little ones of these. I also measured 2.5 inch squares, and all the leftover squares from all the random projects that we've been doing. These are all the leftover squares that are kind of just left around that the people in the church didn't use. And so they're all measured, and they're all cut exactly to 2.5 inches. I also have containers like this, like 1 inch, 2 inch. I did 1 inch, 2 inch, 2.5, 3.5, and whatever sizes that you want to save them. Now I have these in little containers because these are kind of like little pieces. And like right now, before I started the video, I pulled out these two containers and said, you know what, I want to make myself a pinwheel, and saw if I had the colors that would kind of coordinate to make this little so these are two scraps that I had left over from a block that I did earlier that I cut off when I was doing half square triangles. And so I'm going to place them together and just sew a seam on them. Now, because these are scraps, it doesn't really, and just go ahead and sew them. And they say to leave them and just have them hanging in this manner. So now I'm going to build my block. And this isn't about building this block, it's just kind of like a little demonstration of how you can use your scraps to do something. So let's say I'm done with this, and then I go ahead and I add another set of scraps and make sure that I can use them. So here's another set of scraps that I got from, that I did another quilt with, that normally I would throw away. My friend Melanie would hurt me. And here's another set of scraps, and I'm just going to end my sewing with my end scrap, my tail ender. So I'm just going to go ahead and feed it. I'm going to leave it right there, and then I'm going to cut everything off. And cut my pieces off. So now I'm going to show you what you can do with your scraps after you've sewn them. So here we are, and here I have my scrap that I had just sewn. What I'm going to do is I'm going to finger press it open, and if you can see it, it's a half square triangle. Let me move in a little bit. It's a half square triangle. Here it is. I'm going to go ahead and get my square ruler with my seam line, with my line that will rest on my line. And I'm going to go ahead and put it here. I can make a 1.5 inch half square triangle with this. So I'm going to trim off my piece, and I'm going to rotate it. And I want to make sure that I get a full 1/2 inch square triangle. If not, I will turn it into a square inch. So there's one. Here's another piece of fabric that I just sewed that normally I would have a tendency to throw away. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same process. I think I could get a 1/2 inch off of this. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move this. And then I'm going to rotate. And I want to make sure that I have fabric to this edge and fabric to this edge. And I'm going to cut it. Now, here's all my sewn scraps. So sometimes I just want to sit and kind of, and I'm going to do the same process. I can get about a 1.5 inches also. Now, you're probably saying, well, what can you do with that? Because that's what I would say. Well, what can you do with that? Salvage little scraps that normally you would throw away, you can make them usable pieces and do something with them. Like I did a mini pinwheel. These are, I think they were 1 inch. These were 1 inch square, and I made mini pinwheels. I also have here, now with the pieces that I just cut, which these are 1.5 inches, that's what I made this with. And so it becomes usable fabric that you can do something intricate. The neat thing about this process and having these little containers is that everything is already in here and everything's already cut. And when I want to just make a small project, maybe I want to make a pincushion out of an intricate piece, let's say something like this.